Good morning, everybody, and as we like to say here at SafetyChain and Levitt Partners, TGIFF, thank goodness it's FSMA Friday. Today we're very excited for our topic, the ins and outs of the Proposed Produce Rule. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you're having technical issues, we're being sponsored for this event today by WebEx, and you can reach them directly at 1-877-509-3239, 877-509-3239. All of you will receive an email by close of business Monday, and in that email you'll be able to request further information from Levitt Partners or SafetyChain, and you'll also be able to download today's recording as well as the slides. We will be taking questions at the end of the pre-submitted questions, and those of you that are online will be able to submit questions. And as always, for your privacy, you can see the names of our hosts and presenters, and your name, but not the names of the other attendees. So moving forward, as always, we're very excited to have with us our team from Levitt Partners. We've got Dr. David Acheson with us today, and as many of you do know, David has been very, very involved in the creation of the FSMA Foundation and some of the new proposed rules, as well as Melanie Newman, who has joined us on quite a few of our FSMA Fridays to share her expertise. As always, I'm Barbara Levin with SafetyChain, and I'll be your host today. With that, we're going to move into our questions. We've got a couple of pre-submitted questions that we'll give to David and Melanie, and then we'll open it up for questions from our participants. And as we start every FSMA Friday, welcome David and Melanie. And David, before we get into the ins and outs of the Proposed Produce Rule, we love to always ask you, what's the latest and greatest from the FDA with FSMA? And I guess there is some latest and greatest.
Sure is, Barbara. Yeah, no, this is David Acheson. Pleasure to be with you again on FSMA Friday. Yeah, big day for FSMA. For those of you on the phone who don't know, today the FDA released two new proposed rules, one on foreign supply verification programs for importers for human and animals, and the other for the accreditation of third-party auditors. The good news here is that on a quick look, they're not nearly as long as the other two. They're several hundred pages as opposed to over 1,000 when you put them together. Clearly too early to get into any details, but at a very quick look, I'm not seeing a lot of surprises in the third-party audit, but a few little surprises in the foreign supply verification. So, so more to come on that, but that is clearly late-breaking and hot. Second point is in this latest announcement from FDA, they have further extended the comment period on the two rules that are out already, preventive controls and produce. They have further extended both of those by another 60 days, which essentially aligns all four of these rules together. So we have an opportunity to be able to put them all together and read all four as a block, and thus make any other further changes to comment on the first two, preventive controls and proposed produce rule, which obviously we're going to talk about. So it's a hot topic, Barbara, so let's keep moving.
It is a hot topic, and as Melanie and David and I discussed before we started today, because we've, as you know, like to be really on the cutting edge here with FSMA Fridays and make sure that we're bringing you the latest and greatest. You'll get a mail about this, but we've decided now to change the topic for our August 23rd FSMA Friday, and we're going to have that FSMA Friday be to answer your questions about the third-party auditor and foreign supplier verification rule. So more on that later, but let's get to today's topics, the ins and outs of the new produce rule. And Melanie, I'm going to reach out to you here. Before we get into some of the specific questions, can you provide just a very high-level overview of the general components? I know that there's some parameters there for things like animal encroachment and hygiene and water standards, and the biggest impact on those who are going to have to comply.
Sure, Barbara. Happy to help address that question. There's a lot of moving parts to this produce safety rule. And in general, there's a lot of exemptions and exceptions, but overall, the produce safety rule does apply to produce farms with sales over $25,000 in annual revenues. It applies just to the need to address microbiological hazards versus, and in contrast to the preventive controls rule, which asks facilities to look at microbiological, chemical, physical, and radiological hazards. So here we're just looking at micro issues. Again, I had mentioned that there are several exemptions, so you can be fully exempt from this rule. You could be subject to some qualified exemptions or modified requirements under the rule. So if you're less than $25,000 in revenue a year, you would be exempt. If you are producing raw agricultural products that are deemed rarely consumed raw, you would be exempt. And there is a specific list in the rule of those products based upon consuming occasions of what is deemed rarely consumed raw. Potatoes, peanuts, others are listed in that list. If you're going to be subjecting your produce to further processing with a validated thermal kill step, that is also an exemption. And personal on-farm consumption is an exemption. I'm not going to go into everything with respect to that, but there is opportunity to get yourself out of that rule. As you mentioned, Barbara, key components of the rule are the need to take a look at and monitor for animal encroachment and not harvest your produce if there is evidence of contamination due to wild or domestic animals. There's also a need to take a look at your equipment, your tools, and your buildings for suitable design and for ease of sanitation and cleaning. Worker health and hygiene and training is a huge new requirement, as is the agricultural water quality standards. And this is where we think that is going to be the biggest impact to the produce industry and produce farms. Lastly, there's biological soil amendment standards. There's a lot in this section as far as intervals of when you use amendments with regard to animal soil amendments from animal origins, for example, and a lot of training requirements. So I know I've said a lot in that answer, Barbara, but there's a lot to this rule. There's a lot of standards, and I think out of all of it, David's going to probably address here a little bit later with regard to some of the water standards and the impact to the industry there.
Sure. If you had to name, what's the single biggest impact going to be? Is it just going to be, trying to make sure that everything gets done on time and that it's all documented, or, what do you think the single biggest challenge is going to be there?
Documentation is going to be a significant challenge, Barbara, and the ability to just implement a lot of these training requirements and a lot of this documentation standards, as well as the ability to understand where in your practices you need to implement some of this rule. Just understanding who's in and who's out of this rule, it can be complex. The documentation is going to be mission critical for compliance to the produce safety rule.
Great. Okay. Thank you. David, I'm going to come back to you. People have been wondering, there's a lot on this on the, the online blogs and chats on FSMA. Why did the FDA put all ready-to-eat produce in the same risk category? Seems that, some produce items are riskier than others, for example, leafy greens versus lemons, and that lemon's looking awfully happy there, but what was the logic behind that?
I think, Barbara, this is one of the most contentious parts of the rule, and it's an interesting strategy. Effectively, I think the process here was FDA attempted to try to split produce into different, quote, risk categories. I don't know that for a fact, but I would suspect, knowing them, that's what they were trying to do. And they realized they were just running into trouble because everything melds together. So as Melanie said, what they did was to say, if it's a produce item that is not typically consumed raw, like a peanut because they're roasted, or a potato because they're cooked, then this rule doesn't apply. Everything else goes in the same bucket. This is where it gets difficult because the FDA said, we know we have risks with a variety of products. We've seen it. There's products where we haven't had foodborne illness outbreaks, and probably, you know, your happy lemon sitting there would be one where we don't see a lot of issues with lemons. So obviously the citrus growers and the tree fruit growers are saying, wait a minute, this is not equitable, this is not fair. But the FDA has basically said, we may not have seen a problem with lemons yet or apples yet, but we will. And so we're going to require you all to do the same thing. This is an area where I think we're going to see a lot of comments coming in from the industry. And it wouldn't shock me if this doesn't change a little bit, because it's a little illogical when you're trying to apply science and risk. And I should just comment, actually, that the rule only applies to microbiological hazards. The FDA has not included pesticides and drug residues and all that kind of thing, which arguably could be present on tree fruit, but they're off the table. They're out of it. It's just micro. So this is definitely a little bit of an exception to the straightforward risk-based thinking.
Okay. Melanie, back to you, and I know the question is a mouthful, so I'll give you a minute to think it out here. So FDA has created a new category called mixed-type facilities. A lot of people are wanting to know, what are these exactly, and how do you know if you are one? And you know, some of the other points here, you know, is it difficult to figure out who has to do what, and when a farm is not a farm? And we'll get to this last one. We'll get to this last one in a moment. But what are mixed type facilities, and how would we know if we are one?
Wow, great question, Barbara. And I will first start by acknowledging to say that I think I'm getting the tough questions. Very much acknowledging that this topic is very complicated. And it is very difficult to figure out who's in and who's out and exactly whether or not you are one or not. But in the simplest terms, a mixed-type facility is a facility that you are performing some activities that fall under the Preventive Controls Rule, which basically means you're doing some sort of manufacturing or processing as defined under the Preventive Controls Rule. And you're doing some other activities in your operations that would fall under or place you under the Produce Safety Rule. So you're growing, you're packing, you're storing, things of that activity nature. So you're doing a combination, you're doing a mixture of both that would place you a little bit under the Produce Safety Rule and somewhat also under the Preventive Controls Rule. So it depends on what you're doing with the product, and also whether or not your products are low risk or high risk. So FDA has designated that small and very small businesses that produce products listed as, quote, low risk could be exempt from this rule if you're small or a very small business. So when you take a look at it through that lens, if you're a farm that happens to grow raw agricultural product, but you transform that into a processed food, then you're a mixed type facility depending upon what you're doing with that product. So you would then fall under the Preventive Controls Rule, which would require you then to have a food safety plan. And we've done a webinar on the Preventive Controls Rule before. What gets even more confusing and what we find surprising is, I'll go back to a statement David just made about the happy lemon, is it becomes a bit illogical when you apply science and risk. When you take a look at some of the activities that are deemed to be low risk, for example, if you use tree nuts, for example, FDA will say that chopping and salting and drying are all deemed low-risk activities that doesn't transform your product, not a manufacturing activity, so that would not place you in this category. But if you bake or boil or roast your product, which actually would decrease your risk because it's actually killing or reducing microbiological risk, then you are doing something that would place you in as a manufacturer or a processor and therefore subject you to the preventive control rule and cause you to be this mixed type facility. So it all becomes very, very confusing and somewhat counterintuitive. I will, defer back to David to see if he has any comments to add or to clarify, because again, I go back to my very first comment, which is it is a very complicated topic.
No, I think Mel's done a good job with that. I'd provide two other thoughts, which again I think lend itself to the need for the industry to look at these carefully. Some of the processes that Melanie has outlined that would kick you into a preventive control rule is actually being done on foods, a variety types of produce that will then subsequently be cooked or heat treated. In other words, go through a microbiological kill step. And you start to get into this, well, we're going to further process these anyway, so why are we needing to do this on the farm? And you asked the question right up front, Barbara, is what are some of the biggest challenges with this rule? And frankly, one of the biggest challenges is for farmers to understand it. I think often growers and farmers just approach these things in a different way than manufacturers and processors who have more the culture of understanding this type of approach. So I think there are going to be many out there who essentially earn their living by, quote, growing, but do some of these other things that are going to struggle.
Right, and that are going to bring them into this category. It is a struggle. Just off topic for a moment here, Melanie had mentioned that one of our first FSMA Fridays was on preventive controls, which are going to impact you if you're deemed in mixed type facilities. I wanted to remind that a lot of new people with us today that once you sign up for one FSMA Friday, when you get the link to this recording on Monday, that link will actually give you all of the other recordings as well, and you can go back and look at that one. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more on mixed type facilities and how to figure out how you're impacted. I'm going to come back to you for this one, Melanie, just so that we didn't give you all the hard ones. We're going to come back to David on this one. David, some of the most stringent requirements around the water quality. Why do you think FDA did this? And how do you think farmers who we say are already struggling, how are they going to be able to comply with these requirements?
Well, another complicated issue here, Barbara, with the water quality. This is as to why FDA did it. I think the answer is because there's a recognition that when you apply water directly to a food that you're subsequently going to consume without cooking, you want that water not to contain microbes of concern like Salmonella and E. Coli. So the obvious, it's logical. It makes sense. You don't want to be spraying filthy, dirty, contaminated water all over your fresh produce, and who the heck does that? But in order to control the risk there, what FDA has done is basically say, there are certain things that you do with your water that you are now going to have to undertake microbiological testing to prove that water is okay, to prove from a micro perspective that it doesn't contain bugs of concern. And they're using E. coli, for example, as the marker here. And so what am I talking about? And what water am I talking about? Well, in simple terms, we're talking about water that's likely to come into direct contact with produce or food contact surfaces. Now, this is, again, it's covered produce, so the produce that's not typically consumed raw, like the potatoes, this doesn't apply. But for other things, it does. So if the water is going to come into direct contact with the product or a food contact surface, such as irrigation water that's being applied before or during or after harvest, if it's crop sprays, and if it's used to prevent dehydration and those types of things, then you start to fall into this bracket. So right. So David said, I've got to be able to check my water. I've got to track my water. There's an important part of this proposed rule that essentially gets into you need to make sure your water systems are intact and solid and not leaking, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have time to get into a lot of that. There's more details on our various websites if you need it. But there are two standards for E. coli. The first is one where essentially they're saying zero tolerance. And that effectively they're saying if there are any detectable E. coli in 100 ml water sample, you cannot, and I say not, use the water for a variety of things, such as direct application to produce during or after harvest. You can't use it as an agricultural tea ingredient. You can't use it in which there is direct contact with food contact surfaces. You can't use it for hand washing activities around the harvest time. So this water basically has got to be free of E. coli. Now some of that, hand washing, okay, that makes sense. That's not so hard. Maybe you're using municipal water for that. But during harvest, that's going to be a struggle. Now, if you're using water during the growing season, then the standard's a little more relaxed. You're allowed up to 235 E. coli per 100 ml. So we've got the standards. Next question is, how often do I have to test this? Is it once a season or what? And if you're using the water for those things that I talked about, like direct application to produce during or after harvest or the food contact service, then the frequency with which you have to test that water to look for E. coli depends on the source of the water. And the proposed rule says that if it's surface water, you've got to test it every 7 days. If it's subsurface, i.e. it's a well, then it's got to be tested once a month. So if you're using well water for this stuff, we're looking at once a month. If you're using rivers, ponds, streams, or essentially anything on a surface, then you've got to be testing it every 7 days. So there's not a lot of good news in these water requirements. The logic for them being in there is fairly clear. We know water can transmit bugs. This is going to be another major cost and lift to the food industry, to produce growers. Clearly, there's a need to maintain records in this area. There is one little bit of silver lining in this, and that is the timing for this is long. Some of these smaller growers are going to have up to 6 years to implement the water controls. So the FDA has recognized that this is a heavy lift, and they've added extra time, particularly around the water part of the rule. So a little long and a little complicated, Barbara, but that in a nutshell is what the water's about.
It's a lot there. Melanie, we're gonna ask you this next one. So, and David started to allude to this a little bit, but will these rules apply to all farms in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Yeah, Barbara, in general, the rule does apply to all U.S. farms as well as foreign farms that import produce that are covered produce into the U.S. So anyone that grows, harvests, packs, or holds most produce in its raw or natural state, subject to the exemptions that I noted earlier, like if it's rarely consumed raw, those types of things. Now, another not necessarily a silver lining, but another exception here is there is an opportunity to apply for variances by foreign governments and states, so long as they meet the same safety standards as set out by the rule. But that variance does need to be requested by the relevant regulatory authority on food safety by that foreign government or state. So not just anyone can request a variance.
Okay. All right, great. I'm going to, when we get to our last question for you, David, before we take questions from the audience, I'm going to take us out of full screen. So everybody now should be able to see on the lower right-hand side a QA tab, and you can start to enter your questions now. Just put those in the lower right-hand box and hit, excuse me, and hit send, and we can start to line those up while we come to you for the last of our pre-submitted questions. David, so who's going to inspect these farms? Will FDA hire more inspectors to do this?
I think the short answer to that is no, because they don't have the money to do it. FSMA requires the FDA to collaborate with other regulatory bodies. So I think we're going to see the agency, FDA in this case, do more work with parts of USDA, particularly the Agricultural Marketing Service, who are often already on these farms doing quality work as part of AMS's role. So I think we'll see USDA Agricultural Marketing Services take on a more active, quote, food safety inspectional role. I think we'll see states doing some of this too. But either way, it's going to take cash. It's going to take resources,
Sure.
and you know, we all know they're pretty thin. So I think this is going to be a heavy lift for FDA to do this. But are they going to hire more people to do it? Not anytime soon.
Okay, we're going to get to the questions that I see quite a few of them coming in now. For those of you who do need to leave at the bottom of the hour, we're going to stay on and get to your questions. But if you do need to leave very quickly, again, on Monday you'll get an email which will allow you to download the slides and the recording. If you are registered, there's no need to register for the next FSMA Friday. You'll get that information. As we've always said, to stay up to date, subjects can change based on new rules and releases from FDA. So we're going to have our Friday, August 23rd, FSMA Friday, cover the third-party auditor and foreign supplier verification rule, and we will reschedule the recall topic. You see on the left here some fabulous additional events that we've got coming up. And as you know, we follow every FSMA Friday with a how-to where we show you how food safety chain management technology can actually help you automate many of the compliance tasks required so that you will be ready when you need to be ready. And all of this information is there. Please come see us at IAFP if you're going to be there at booth 415. And on Monday morning, the 29th at IAFP, we're going to have some of the Levitt Partners team. Jackie Bissett will be there and as our guest FSQA expert. So please come on by and meet the rest of the FSMA Friday team, or some of the folks will be there. And David, I believe you're opening that conference, so we'll all get to see you. So with that, let's get to some of the questions that we've got here. And let's see. So let's start with a question from Sarah. And Sarah's asking, in an orchard situation, root systems are developed based on irrigation systems. Changing to drip systems from overhead will kill trees. E. coli is regularly higher in surface waters than the limit. What are some of the mitigation and possibilities in post-harvest treatment? Is that an option? David?
Yes, let's get creative, guys. You're right. I think there's some real challenges here. The key part to all of this, I think, is whether the food and the water come into contact with each other. So this sort of issue around drip irrigation versus spray is something that works well in some instances, but clearly not in others. So if it's drip irrigation and the produce never hits the ground, then we're in good shape. If it's flood irrigation or it's surface irrigation and the produce subsequently hits the ground, for example, almonds, walnuts, which are harvested by getting the product lying on the ground for a couple of weeks. I think this is going to be a challenge. Now, obviously, the question is mitigations. It's going to be looking at ways that you, if the way you're using your water falls under the requirement of the rule when it's final, then the expectation is you're going to have to control E. coli in it. And, you know, that's going to be done through water sourcing, testing. I guess there's a variety of water treatments. I'm not an expert on water filtrations and other treatment systems, but they're out there. But you know, of course, this is going to ramp up costs. So I think we've got to strike a balance here. It's not an easy thing to figure out.
Okay. That's going to lead us in then with Greg's question of, don't the water rules differ for spray applications versus drip?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm saying, I think the principle of this rule is that if the water is coming into contact with the edible portion of the crop, then you need to control the water quality. So my interpretation of that, going back to the happy lemon, is that, and I'm no expert on citrus, and somebody's going to say, David, you can't water citrus trees that way, you'll kill them. But if you are watering a tree or some sort of a row crop or something, using a mechanism whereby the water does not come into direct contact with the edible portion, then I think that puts you in a very different place than if you were spraying it directly onto the edible portion. That is fairly clear in terms of the direct application of water to the edible part. So I think it's Greg who asked the question. I think he's right. If you're not coming into contact, then you can relax somewhat, at least on that part.
Yeah. I don't think anybody's relaxing in full, but another little silver lining. Steve is saying he's a packaging supplier. Has there been or will there be a webinar on this subject? Certainly some issues for packaging suppliers will be covered in the approaches to supply chain controls on the 22nd. And we will definitely put that on the list to add as a topic. It sounds like it would be a good topic, and there's, you know, the more the rules come out, the more there'll be to comment on that. And so we'll make sure that you know about that one when it gets scheduled. Melanie, Danny's asking, how will the customer handle the transportation companies that haul their products when it comes to the documentation requirements?
That's a great question and a really great concern. My recommendation, first and foremost, would be definitely write that into your contracts. As far as beefing up your contracts, as far as the responsibilities and duties of your transportation carriers, what do they need to do by way of information delivery, capture, and documentation for you, so that if they don't, you've actually got a potential breach of contract claim against them. And it's really having a very robust, direct conversation with them of what exact information do you need from them to have them captured, to have them delivered to you, and actually put in place some consequences if they don't. But you know, if it's just a handshake, if it's just a verbal, hey, you need to give me this information, and they don't, there's not going to be a lot you can hang your hat on if you're not getting that delivered. And again, we go back to, if it's not written down, if it's not captured and documented, and if it's, you know, and if it's not done real time, then to the agency, it didn't happen.
Sure. Brian is asking, let's see, I know that, David, you answered the last water question, so I'll give this one to you. Can you review the frequency of water testing?
Yeah. The way it's currently proposed in the rule is, as I mentioned, it varies according to the type of water that you're using. If you're using surface water, then it's every week, every 7 days. If it's subsurface, it's once a month, in simple terms, is what's in the proposed rule.
Okay. Let's see. Got a question from for Jim. Jim's getting his August 23rd questions in early. I love it. Jim's saying, hi, for third-party auditors, the website says the accreditation of third-party auditors for foreign facilities, foreign food facilities. What about U.S. auditors auditing U.S. farms? Does that rule apply? You want to take that, one of you, or do you want to hold off on that one till the next one?
No, I'm happy to jump in on that one, and I will confess I haven't read the rule yet. It only came out at 9:30 this morning, so I'm not fully up to speed. But the based on the law, the FDA does not have the authority to require accreditation of domestic auditors. The whole purpose of the third-party audit program was for foreign manufacturers and processors and growers that are under the preventive control rule and produce rules. So the third-party audit piece is, as Jim has indicated, is really focused on foreign facilities and is not a requirement for U.S. domestic farm auditing or U.S. domestic manufacturing and processing auditing, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm.
But like I say, I don't think the rule is going to be different because the FDA doesn't have the authority to take this domestic, and I know that that's not their intent. So I feel pretty confident that's right.
Okay. Melanie, Jim is commenting and asking a question here. What does FDA expect buyers and the public to do with the produce rule not making any mention of following pesticide labels? This seems to be a real oversight. Do you have any comments on that?
Again, I think there's a lot you can do by way of managing your exposure and your liability by way of contracts and just by way of limiting responsibility in that respect. Testing and, managing expectations that way is another way that you can manage it, but really laying out the foundation of expectations of what pesticides obviously are, acceptable to you as a customer, not to mention what's allowed by law and EPA and so forth, are things that you have to have, very direct dialogue about as well. I'm not sure if that goes to the heart of Jim's question or not, but based upon, what I heard and understood, those would be my initial comments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd add just a little extra to that. I think what Melanie said is exactly right. The explanation as to why FDA only focused on microbiological risk was effectively in their preamble to the rule, where they're saying it's not that we don't think chemicals, pesticides are not important from a public health perspective, but in the, quote, grand scheme of things, microbiological risk for produce is much more of a problem through their eyes. So they're not sort of saying these other things are not a problem. They're basically saying this produce rule is focused on controlling micro risk because we see that as the biggest risk that we need to control right out of the gate. So, this begs the point where at some point in the future, we will see new laws enacted to give the FDA the authority to do other things on farms. I personally believe they have the authority in FSMA to be able to control chemicals, et cetera, and to do some of these things that have just been suggested. But they've made the decision at this point to focus on micro. But so you've got to come up with other ways to control your risk. But right now it's not a compliance risk because the FDA's produce rule doesn't get into that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, I think that was our last question. As always, David and Melanie, thank you so much. We hope we see all of you on August 16th, where we're going to show you, how software technology can help you automate many of these requirements so that you can start getting ready. And we hope that we see you on some of these other great events that you see there on the screen. Everybody have a great rest of your Friday. And again, August 23rd, Foreign Supplier Verification Rule and Third-Party Auditor Rule just added. And thank you, FDA, for always giving us something new to speak about. And David and Melanie, always have a great day, and thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.